I'm going to call our meeting to order. This is the regular meeting of the Ojai Planning Commission for October 18th, 2017. Members of the public wishing to address the Planning Commission on items appearing on the agenda are requested to complete a speaker's card and file it with the secretary prior to the start of the meeting. Cards are available in the lobby. Speakers should state their name and address for the record, and please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. Comments must be directed to the Commission, not the audience. While the Planning Commission is in session, all in attendance are expected to maintain order and decorum and to obey the orders of the chair. Could we have the roll call, please?
Chair Merck.
Here.
Vice Chair Quillisi.
Here.
Commissioners Nolan.
Here.
Jagiello. Here. Corbin.
Here.
Zabilla.
Here.
Powers.
Here.
Commissioner Nolan, could you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Or not?
Oh, you asked me? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Public communications is the time set aside during the Planning Commission meeting for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on items of city business other than scheduled agenda items. Matters raised at this time may be briefly discussed by the Commission and will generally be referred to staff and/or placed on a subsequent agenda. Under state law, other than for emergency items, no action can be taken at this meeting. Is there anyone who would like to speak on something that is not on the agenda? Okay, we'll move on to the consent items. All matters listed on the consent calendar are to be considered routine by the governing bodies and will be enacted by one motion in the form listed. There will be no discussion of these items unless before the governing body votes on the motion to adopt. Specific items are removed from the consent calendar for separate motions. We have only one item, which is the minutes of the regular meeting of the Planning Commission for September 20th, 2017. Would anyone like to approve?
I move approval.
All right.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Could we have a roll call, please?
Nolan.
Yes.
Jagiello.
Yes.
Corbin.
Yes.
Quillisi.
Yes.
Merck.
Yes.
Zabilla.
Yes.
Powers.
Yes.
Next is disclosure of site visits and ex parte contacts. Disclosure by commissioners of site visits and ex parte contacts for items on the agenda. Commissioner Nolan, could you start us off there?
Yes, I visited the site and had no ex parte contacts.
I visited the site and had no ex parte contact.
I visited the site, had no ex parte contacts.
I visited the site, had no ex parte contacts.
Commissioner
I
Isabella?
visited the site and had no ex parte contacts.
I visited the site and had no ex parte contacts.
Thank you. And I think all of us are extremely familiar with the site by now, and I've had no ex parte contacts. We're going to start with our public hearing item. This is item 2, design review permit DRP 15-12, development agreement DA 17-01, and lot line adjustment LLA 1701 for exterior improvements at 334 East Ojai Avenue, assessors parcel number 0210140, 140, and 130. Project involves a lot line adjustment to city-owned property and to private property by the applicant to accommodate outdoor patio space and the commercial renovation of the existing building to accommodate restaurant uses. The general plan designation of the site is general commercial. The zoning classification is commercial. A categorical exemption has been prepared pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act. Property owners are the Shanks Investment Group. This is continued from the October 4th, 2017 Planning Commission meeting. Could we hear from staff on this, please?
Yes, thank you, and good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. I'd like to point out, first of all, that in the packet that the Planning Commission received, the recommendation concerning this item was that no action is required as no new plans were submitted. This agenda was the agenda was actually prepared prior to receiving those plans, which were submitted late last week. However, the public hearing has been duly noticed, and a revised agenda was prepared, and you have a copy of that on the dais. That was posted on the city's website, containing the more accurate recommendation concerning conduct of this hearing, and adoption of the resolutions that pertain to this particular project. So the city attorney has advised that we may proceed.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. As I indicated, or I should say, the Planning Commission has considered this project on a number of occasions. I won't go into detail concerning the specifics of the project description. Members of the Commission are very familiar with it. At your previous meeting, a motion to approve the project failed. The applicant, since that time, has submitted new plans. And for the record, they are the plans in your packet that contain the October 10th, 2017 date. Your packet also contains a second set of plans dated June 29th, 2017. Those are the previous plans identified as option or scheme C that the City Council asked to be evaluated, or directed that that option be evaluated against the Arcade Plaza design guidelines. The new plan, which was provided in your packet, along with a transmittal memo, because of the shortness of time to turn these plans around for tonight's hearing, the transmittal memo summarized the key changes that the applicant is proposing based on their information that was provided. And then on October 16th, the commission was provided with a memorandum from Jay Higgins, principal planner, that did a more thorough evaluation of the new submittal against the Arcade Plaza design guidelines. As you can see from your plans in your packet, the proposal that was submitted last week does substantially conform to option C that was previously considered by the Planning Commission and City Council. We have much more specificity with this proposal in terms of the colors that are going to be used. There are specifications provided. The applicant also responded to the comments that were made by the Commission in terms of the railing that is going to be used along the public arcade. And changes in the landscape plan per the discussion and motions that were made by the Commission at your previous meeting. We have here the material boards. I'll ask Commissioner Nolan to share those, if you would. I also have a full set of colored plans if the Commission so desires to look at that. We did try and cut down on the volume of paper with this submittal. I should also point out, and I appreciate Commissioner Zabilla pointing this out, on your draft resolution, attachment A, page 5 of 12, condition number 2, we would like to recommend the following changes. The approved project shall be substantially consistent with the approved architectural and landscape exhibits dated October 10th, 2017, consisting of sheets A3.1, A3.2, A3.3, A3.6, and L1. The other sheets that were listed in this originally make reference, and I do have copies of those if you have an interest, made reference, there was a title sheet, there was the existing site plan. They're really not pertinent to the actual exhibits that are necessary for the approval of the project. Again, your draft resolution contains the recommended conditions of approval, and there is the previous staff report also contained in your packet. The applicant is also here this evening with graphics and illustrations. And at this point, I'd like to answer any questions that members of the commission may have for me.
Thank you, Mr. Winiger. Do any commissioners have questions for staff?
I do.
Kathleen?
Did we, or is there a sample of the railing, or specifically of the finish of the railing?
Yes.
Yes.
Not the finish per se, but there is an illustration that we shared last time.
All right.
I'll
And
find
I
that.
can ask the applicant. when they
Yes.
come up.
Mhm.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions for staff?
I was just, and that could be a condition if you would like to, for the file, for the record, get an example of that finished. We can certainly require that.
All right. Could we hear from the applicant?
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. Mirroring Matt's comments, really a brief presentation because on the design, not a lot changed. Obviously, the colors have been altered per the Commission's recommendations. To the design, yes, the railing has changed. I have tried to try and get physical samples. That particular sample, they don't have anything for in the past. When they've given me miniaturized samples. Hasn't been that useful in planning commissions. So I did the illustration. The illustration is actually taken directly from their file. Go.
Yeah, so the question I had was, and I know that it's going to be black, and you actually showed a visual last time. And I was wondering if it was more of a matte black or if it was like a glossy black. It just said black, I believe, in our packet. And I was hoping more for the matte black that would coincide more with the wrought iron kind of finished.
Okay, we didn't specify.
Okay.
But I think that that's a good angle to go for. I agree. I'd be happy to take that as a recommendation.
Thanks.
The only other design element that was changed was, again, at the direction, was removing these trees from the alleyway because of concerns about thoroughfare and free passage through. Let me just run through these slides. I know that you've seen these, but for the public's sake, the plaster colors have been changed. The trellis color was adjusted slightly. Colors that were already conforming to the palette that was liked by the commission from C. If, for example, on the stain for the trellis, the name change, it's only as a result of the contractors and people involved wanting to specify from particular brands that they have best effect with. And also, we had a concern, because of the discussion about field matching and how important it was to make sure that what you approved was going to be built. I ran through with a new piece of software to match into Sherwin-Williams' current palette the tones that were displayed actually on the model. So hopefully that gives you the best chance of approving and reviewing what you see tonight. So running through, again, yes, the palette changed. We now have the front from Main Street, main building, West Highland, white. And the main color on the rear, larger building, is called Bungalow Beige, and they're both Sherwin-Williams colors. So back to the railing, I just wanted to give you a little detail. That's what, when it repeats, that's the design. And again, it looks very dark in this particular monitor, but those eyebrow details match the Mission Brown stain that is on the materials board. The base details, again, apologies for how it's rendered here, but it's actually on the original. It's a brown matching. And back to the front. So really, that concludes my presentation. Just really here for your questions. Thank you.
That was very short and sweet. Thank you, Ben. Do we have questions for the applicant? Anybody? Thank you, Ben. This is a public hearing, and I don't have any speakers cards, but I'm wondering if anyone from the public would like to speak on this. All right. We will close the public hearing, and we will debate the issue. Is there debate, or would someone like to make a proposal?
I just have a quick comment.
All right.
I want to thank the applicant for accommodating the concerns of the commission and for providing this kind of specificity. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion?
Go ahead and make a motion
All right.
if there's nothing further. All right. So I'll make a motion that the Planning Commission approve design review permit DRP 15-12, lot line adjustment LLA 17-01, with notice of exemption and development agreement DA 17-01, between the City of Ojai and Shanks Investment Group LLC for the exchange of property to relocate the paseo and the construction of patio space for outdoor dining located at 334 East Ojai Avenue. And then also, I just want to make note of the modification to the conditions of approval, page 5 of 12, attachment A, number 2, and that should read, the approved project shall be substantially consistent with the approved architectural and landscape exhibits dated October 10th, 2017, consisting of sheets A 3.1, A 3.2, 3.3, 3.6, those all being A, and L.1. And then I just did want to add the railing be of a matte finish. If there's any objections from my fellow commissioners.
I'll second that.
All right, thank you. Is there any?
I'd like to suggest
Yep.
one technical amendment to that.
All right.
Sheet A1 as presented to us is the only one that is not dated October 10th. It's dated September 6th. And so I'd like to
3-1?
see that. Pardon me? No, L1.
L1.
L1, the last sheet
I
is
missed
the
that.
only one not dated October 10th. So
yes.
I would ask that the motion be modified to include September 6th on that sheet.
Yes, so please modify my motion for the change being the date on sheet L1 to September 6th,
All right.
Thank
Chester,
you.
you're okay with that?
Yes.
2017.
All right. Any further discussion? Could we have a roll call vote, please?
Nolan?
Yes.
Yagiello?
Yes.
Corbin?
Yes.
Quilisi?
Yes.
Merck?
Yes.
Zabilla?
Yes.
Powers?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Piece of cake, Ben.
Thank you again for your patience with our process here. Appreciate it. Thank you. We are going to move on to item 3, which is a discussion item regarding tiny homes. And could we hear from staff on this?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The commission has previously received a presentation on tiny homes or tiny houses, and the issue was raised once again during the Planning Commission and City Council discussions on the accessory dwelling unit regulations. The City Council directed that the matter be referred back to your commission for discussion and possible development of a term sheet, which Mr. Summers can discuss in further detail. Staff took a look at the previous presentation that the Planning Commission received. We have attached that as an exhibit or attachment to your staff report. We also did a brief search, document search of other articles that might be of interest and help refine the discussion concerning this issue, and those are attached in there as well. The first attachment, attachment A 101, is a list of issues that staff collectively have identified as being potentially pertinent to this issue. And it includes definitions. There are tiny houses on wheels, also which go by the acronym THOW, as well as permanent foundation forms of tiny homes. The use is an issue. Would they be exclusively used as residences, or is there interest in allowing them to be used for other purposes, such as offices, studios, or what have you? Code issues are a big issue when it comes to these sorts of structures. What type of permits are required in terms of building and planning permits? What codes apply to the construction of these types of units? They generally do not conform to the Uniform Building Code or the ICC code or the International Residential Code, the IRC. in terms of minimum dwelling unit sizes, room sizes, and what have you. If they are to be used as residences, what would be required in terms of kitchen and bathroom fixtures and what have you. How will electrical power be provided to these structures? Are they provided by drop cords or permanent connections? Are those placed underground in accordance with the city's ordinances, what have you? And who's going to plan, check, inspect, and certify the type of construction? Zoning ordinance considerations include setback requirements. Can this be used as a primary structure on a lot, on a vacant lot? If so, what are the development requirements that might go with that, or would they be allowed potentially as an approach to the accessory dwelling unit opportunities? Parking requirements, design review, and so on. Another significant issue is utility connections, permanent water supply, wastewater connections, and again, electrical service. And then another more esoteric issue is how are these structures taxed? Are they taxed as real estate? Are they taxed as personal property through vehicle licensing? And what development fees apply? So what we suggest tonight for your consideration is that we consider this an issue identification exercise. We would appreciate your validation of these issues. Are they all pertinent? Are there issues that are not pertinent? Are there issues that we haven't identified that should be considered? And then, depending on the consensus of the commission, Mr. Summers would be able to potentially put together a term sheet for consideration by the city council. In the absence of consensus, we could at least bring the issues that were raised to city council for their direction back to staff and the commission. So with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Summers to make some comments regarding the issue of the term sheet and how it apply here.
Thank you. Mr. Summers?
Chair, Commissioners, thank you, Mr. Winiger. We've identified some of the key issues to consider in evaluating these types of tiny houses. The other key one is to consider that there's different kinds of tiny houses. The phrase tiny house is used by different folks to mean different kinds of things. There's tiny houses on wheels, tiny houses on foundations, tiny houses that might be on wheels but skirted to look like a foundation. So in considering the issues, consider some, all, or where the commission would like to make recommendations to council. In terms of outcome of tonight, staff is looking for, if there's at least broad consensus on a couple of issues, to recommend something that we could package and bring to council as a recommended term sheet. If there isn't broad consensus, and that's okay, we're early in this process, then at least develop the discussion on the issues that have been identified so that Mr. Winiger and I could work together on bringing a developed set of issues to the council. In either case, the next step is for the council to look at this to decide whether the council is interested in this commission and staff further analyzing tiny houses, or if the council is not of that mind. And then we'll go from there once we know where council feels. So that's what we're looking for tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, one more item that we, in terms of issue identification that we didn't add here, was should they be considered as temporary uses? Many owners of these sort of mobile tiny houses tend to be itinerant. They move from place to place following jobs or employment opportunities or what have you. Is there an interest allowing them for short terms but not permanently? That's another issue that could potentially be considered.
Thank you. Kathleen?
This is just a suggestion. And I'm wondering, after our discussion, and maybe we send it back to staff, is if we could organize this on a spreadsheet and separate the different options out. In other words, there's tiny house on wheel, tiny house meaning a house that's just small, an ADU, maybe that's a studio. And I know we've had this in the past. And then under that, we could itemize and have use. Then we could add out all these code issues and then basically be able to check it off and I think address it maybe in a more orderly fashion. And one thing we may want to add to the code issue is even like fire zone. depending on, you know, if it's a tiny house on wheels, a tiny house on foundation, and what have you, but that might be affected. But personally, I think that would be a good way to organize it and make it easier to work on.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for staff? Mr. Quilisi?
Oh, thank you. And this is for Mr. Summers. I pulled the Title 10, Chapter 2, and specifically 10-2-1709 D Delta 1C, which reads as follows: mobile homes, parenthesis, except those fitting the definition of Section 18007 of the Health and Safety Code, state law, and travel trailers shall not be permitted as second units. And so then I pulled Section 18007 of the Health and Safety Code, and I read it, and I don't understand it. And I'm hoping maybe you can clarify what it means. It looks like, it talks about manufactured homes, but it doesn't say on wheels, not on wheels, big, small, or in between. And the ordinance in that particular section just says mobile homes, except those that fit this definition I don't understand, are not permitted. And it kind of sounds like if you have a big manufactured home, like a double-wide long trailer, that is not prohibited in the city. And I thought
Yes,
it was, so I remain confused.
Yeah, happy to clarify, and admittedly, I am quickly looking up the sections you've just provided. 18007 is part of the Health and Safety Code. That's part of the state's regulation of manufactured housing,
Right.
which is defined as houses that are transportable in one or more sections with some size limitations,
Yep.
built on a permanent chassis and intended to be used as a single-family dwelling. Manufactured homes are not prohibited in the city. They are regulated as to placement, size, underlying zoning, some others, but they're not prohibited. They are generally considered as distinct from, quote, tiny homes, both because manufactured homes tend to be bigger than tiny houses, and because many tiny houses are built on vehicle foundations, whether or not they're still on wheels. The classic being a tiny house built on a tractor-trailer chassis. And so that's where the section you cited, 10-2-1709, if I remember correctly, that prohibits other kinds of mobile homes in the city except those state regulated manufactured homes, which are the typical ones you see, either the single or the double width in a typical mobile home park.
They're not self-propelled, but they are mobile.
They don't even have an engine. Well, the other key about manufactured homes is that they are not themselves mobile. In other
Right,
words,
they're not self-propelled.
they're not, but there's another point. They're not self-propelled, they don't have an engine, and manufactured homes do not have their own wheels. They're put on a trailer, which is then moved from the factory to the site. Then they're moved on and they parked on the site. That's a traditional manufactured home, or often referred to as a mobile home. Those are not actually, they can be picked up and put back on a trailer, but they don't retain the wheels on site generally. I'm sure there's an exception or two. And in the market, a manufactured home stays put where it is. A mobile home stays put. That's why, among other things, there's very particular rules about rent control under state law in certain jurisdictions for manufactured homes because the ownership is split. Individuals own the home, but they rent the space on which the home is placed, versus tiny houses sometimes retain the wheels.
They're meant to be more mobile.
They can be more mobile, although not always. Again, tiny house it's a colloquial term, not a legally defined term, except in those jurisdictions that have adopted ordinances. The quote classic tiny house often retains its wheels. I hope that helps clarify some of that.
That helps some.
Let me-
That helps some. If I could ask one follow-up question then, because I'm still struggling with the concept that maybe I'm in error, that a tiny home on wheels is a trailer. You can hook up one end of it and drag it behind a truck.
I think
And
that's
as such,
exactly-
I think it's regulated by the DMV, not the city.
The HCD.
Commissioner Isabella is correct. It would be HCD. The city has the power to regulate them itself as well. In other words, at the moment, it would be unlawful to park a trailer that still has its wheels on land in this city and live in it. That would be a violation of various provisions of the city's code.
Okay.
The question before the commission is whether to recommend that the council change that law.
Okay.
In other words, whether it's the commission recommends people being allowed to live in tiny houses on wheels under various rules and regulations and structures.
How about tiny houses on permanent foundations?
That is also another question before this commission.
Okay, so we really have two separate,
They're part of this
Separate
bigger
tracks.
tiny house question. So one is, does the commission wish to recommend the council consider allowing tiny houses on wheels? And/or does the commission wish to recommend that the council consider allowing tiny houses but not on wheels? And then the question becomes one of definitions. What does a tiny house mean at that point? Generally, going back, if I may real quickly, going back to the colloquial definition of tiny house is used in the tiny house advocacy community, they are distinct from stick-built. They're not formal manufactured homes because they don't meet those state standards, which are rather specific and designed to be that minimum single-width manufactured home size. They're smaller than that. But they're not stick-built on-site on a permanent foundation. They're often built off-site in a separate factory on a chassis and transported, or built on designed to be plopped on an existing foundation prepared on-site and transported on a trailer. The method can vary. And those are the questions before the commission, is whether to recommend the council consider allowing some, all, or none of these different categories. Thank you.
Thank you. I know Commissioner Isabella has a question, but I just want to say there are a number of manufactured homes which have been installed in Ojai over the years, and they're all on foundations, and you would have a hard time telling them apart from
Right.
regular residents.
Manufactured homes which meet that provision of the state law must by law be permitted in single-family zones. The state has preempted local authority in that respect.
And we've run into
Just
that
to make it
before.
real clear, those are allowed. Manufactured homes are allowed in the city, in any single-family zone, subject to some rules.
Yeah, they have to have a foundation on them for one thing.
They require a permanent foundation, they require attachment to that permanent foundation, and they have to meet the rest of the building code, utilities, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Isabella has a question.
I just wanted, just from a process point of view, since this is just a discussion tonight and we're not taking any action tonight, but just even in terms of a discussion, I shared this with Mr. Winiger earlier today, we have really very little information in terms of an analysis from which to get very specific about. And what we do have is really just statements, two articles from advocates of tiny homes, and also people who are not only advocates, but who have a financial interest in tiny homes. And so I'm just not really sure. I'd just like to caution us that we don't start straying into areas that we may not have enough information about. I know some of my fellow commissioners have studied the subject more, but I definitely would like to see I'd like to see actually more direction from council as to what direction they're going before we get really deep in the weeds with getting too specific, because we have had experience at this commission of spending a lot of time on something and sort of being off track with really where they're headed. So I'm hoping we can keep this fairly general with what we actually know, and hope staff can derive some consensus from that. I would like to just clarify, and this was one of my concerns with the information provided, on attachment B, page 23, it talks about, I'll just quote, this was what was provided. Just this year, Fresno City zoning approved tiny houses on wheels as backyard cottages without the requirement for the tiny house dweller to serve as a caregiver. This created a ripple effect, as Stevens put it, with the Planning Commission in the town of Ojai currently drafting amendments for the same type of allowance. It just concerns me when
Not
we're
so.
being provided in a staff report stuff that we haven't even done, and it's being presented as fact. So I hope we can all just take a step back and make sure we have the facts before we're really making decisions.
Mr. Summer, I wonder if you could also clarify for the audience what the term sheet involves. that's, I think, is going to be the output of our discussions, and
Well, and it may be the case, depending on where the commission's discussions go tonight, that we don't graduate to a full term sheet. And part of the point, to speak to Commissioner Zabilla, is that staff hasn't analyzed these in detail pending council direction to do so. We put in enough analysis to be able to have a meaningful conversation. And that's what our goal is tonight. And then we expect a meaningful conversation with the council, at which council will make the initial decision whether to analyze these things in further detail or not. In terms of a term sheet, the model we've used in the ADU context most recently, and in the sign ordinance context and some others, is a bulleted list of proposed changes. Not a full ordinance, not fully drafted, but a bulleted list of, we're going to consider amending the sign ordinance to do these three things. Then that would then go from the commission to the council. The council would say, this sounds good, go draft, and Mr. Winiger and I would draft, bring it to the commission for consideration in a public hearing, and then back to council in a further public hearing. Or, in the recent context of the proposed temporary special events permits for single-family residential houses, this commission looked at a term sheet, which then went to council, and the council said, no, we're not interested in doing that at this time, which saved the city from paying my time and staff's time and the energy of this commission and the council's time to further analyze something that the council wasn't interested in. That's why the term sheet model has proven valuable, as it's a chance for an early check-in with the elected body as to where their feeling is on a matter before we go down any rabbit holes.
yes, thank you. I look forward to a meaningful conversation. Commissioner Nolan.
At the beginning of our discussion, I had kind of loosely made the recommendation about putting a spreadsheet together. You know, if my fellow commissioners are interested, to me, I feel like that would really expedite the process. It would just organize this so that we could kind of go through it systematically.
Like we did with the ADU.
Yeah, so in other words,
Matrix.
if we had at the top of the heading, it would be like tiny house on wheels, then maybe a primary residence, ADU. In other words, we could break it out, whether it had a foundation, was it on wheels, studio, residence, and then, of course, go into all the code issues. And then we could go across on the spreadsheet and say, oh, well, that falls under the Department of Motor Vehicles, or that falls under the building code. And I feel like it would just sort it out easier and make the process simpler. That's
I can
my
see where that would-
opinion. But
that
I would like to make the request, but, everybody shied in.
Yeah, no, it sounds like that would be the beginning of a term sheet, too. You could just take the
Right.
one
Yeah,
column and say,
exactly.
here it is.
Well, that's what they did with the ADU agreement. They actually took our term sheet and made it part of the ordinance in the end.
Yeah,
So I think that's a great idea, actually, to organize the information.
good. All right.
I do see one issue that is not on this list, and it's a fine list, but one that interests me is the actual floor area of the structure that we're talking about. When we did ADUs, all we did is a maximum size. We did not say, at least in this latest TA 1508, we did not specify a minimum size for an ADU.
I think there's a state minimum size of 220, but I think that's changing.
Well,
I hear it's going to
again, right.
150 or 120.
The current minimum,
Yeah.
the city's ordinance does not set a minimum size for accessory dwelling units. State law sets it in the current state building code, which I believe is 220 square feet.
which is bigger than most of the tiny houses that I suspect we'll be talking about.
Which is one of the areas that needs to be considered by this commission and the council, and perhaps the Building Appeals Board, as directed by the council, is where to set the size for tiny houses, and how to set that in relation to the California Building Code.
I believe there's a document, an HCD document dated May 2016 or September, that it is entitled Tiny Homes, and it sort of breaks out the different, I should have brought it, the different,
December 2016?
no,
An earlier one?
It's an HCD paper. It's about 5 pages long, and it's entitled Tiny Homes, and there was a revision to it. And it sort of breaks out the minimums, and it also sort of breaks down, the different types of on-wheel vehicles. An RV is distinct from, and even that document, when I read it, it's sort of like they're not exactly clear what category it falls into. Travel trailer, RV, doesn't have a motor, but anyway, but that document I think will be important to include in a next analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a number of speakers cards, and I wonder if we could, Ray, did you want to? Yeah.
In terms of distinction, because right now we're saying tiny homes on wheels and tiny homes not on wheels. But a tiny home not on wheels, isn't that defined as an efficiency housing?
It would depend on whether it meets the particular definitions of an efficiency unit in the State Health and Safety Code. State Health and Safety Code provisions define an efficiency unit as 150 square feet, and including a bedroom, but not necessarily including bathroom and kitchen. That is tied to a larger set of state laws that allow the city to approve such types of efficiency units. The choice falls to the council. The council has not yet chosen to approve such efficiency units as separate units that do not have a complete independent living facility, meaning that they do not have a complete sleeping, sanitation, and eating facilities. City has a choice to do that or not. State law has a couple of different provisions to do that. One is the efficiency units. Another is what's called the junior ADUs. Another provision that's discussed in the HCD document that Vice Chair Quilici referenced is a December 2016 paper put out by HCD regarding ADUs that also discusses the junior ADU program, another choice that the council may exercise but has not yet done so. A junior ADU is similar to an efficiency unit. It does not have separate sanitation and separate eating kitchen facilities. A tiny house on wheels, or a tiny house not on wheels rather, is as I understand the general model that's used, it has a complete kitchen, so it wouldn't fit under the efficiency definition under that State Health and Safety Code definition. But again, it's one of those things where define the term and then you're looking at how to fit it into existing, and not just how to fit into existing laws, but also what new law does the council wish to make, and this commission wish to recommend to the council, because we aren't necessarily tied to those existing definitions. To a fairly broad limit, we can vary them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I do have,
Just one more.
all right, jump in.
Thank you. At one of our recent cases you introduced, and I found it in the code, it was there, I'd never seen it before, the definition of an accessory unit, not an accessory dwelling unit, but an accessory unit. This had to do with, I believe, the structure that was built over a new garage at 207 East Eucalyptus. And could you run through again very briefly the definition of an accessory unit, because that may play into what we're talking about too, I'm not sure.
Yes, happy to. I believe you're referencing accessory structure. It's distinct from accessory unit.
Accessory structure.
Yeah, so accessory structure was a new definition added to the code by the council on this commission's recommendation in the new ADU ordinance. An accessory structure is a building that is conditioned or not, that has no more bathroom facilities than a half bath and does not include a kitchen, that is permitted in addition to an ADU on a residential property, as distinct from a guest house, which would be conditioned space with a full bathroom or more than one full bathroom, that is generally not permitted in addition to an ADU, with a few exceptions that amount to, if you have a guest house, you are allowed to convert the interior of your existing primary residence, or the interior of that guest house may be converted to an ADU. But if you start with an ADU, you can't add a guest house. We added that, the council added that definition of accessory structure to distinguish it from guest house, in order to allow a property to have, say, a pool house, where you have a half bath, but you don't have a full bath, and you don't have a second or a third kitchen in that example. So tiny houses, again, could fit into that depending on how they're structured. Some tiny houses, I would imagine, don't have full kitchen or bathroom facilities. It may be the case that it's more of a rear bedroom that shares its kitchen with the front unit. So it would depending on how much of a bathroom it have, it would be permitted under that. So there's a bit of an overlap here on some of these other issues. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I have two speakers cards here. And the first one is from Xavier Cabarga.
Well, thank you all for considering this issue. I am a tiny house advocate. And I must say that I reached out to one of the council members to maybe get some background on what the mood was. And that person said that she was waiting for really to find out what your mood was, and had questions herself and couldn't really give me much. And I must say that the way Mr. Summers and Nolan and have characterized this, the issue and the solving of the issue is a great beginning in terms of just defining what needs to be considered. I feel that, let's see, I lost my train. Well, so obviously there are two approaches here. One would be that you would allow a homeowner, a property owner, to place a tiny house on their property. And this, I believe, would be a great benefit not only to our not enough housing, not enough units in the city, but I feel like the essence of the tiny house movement is its mobility, so that if Ojai runs out of water, we can drive it up to Oregon, or decide to move to Montana, or what have you. So the idea of requiring a foundation, that it would benefit added rental units, but it's a little bit different than the tiny house movement, which kind of wants that mobility. So I would ask that you consider that what you're going to have to be considering here is really a lot of mind changing and a lot of changing the way things have been looked at, up till now. And I hope you'll be open to that, to the idea that, well, what if there is a house that's a tiny house on wheels that someone can put on their property and then move it? You'll have that rental unit for the year, and then maybe another one will move in place. But I don't know that kind of transience poses any kind of danger in a sense to the community. I think most people who build a house on wheels are not necessarily wanting to travel. Some are. They're wanting to remain as long as they can, if it's legally permitted. So the other issue I know is you talked about taxes, and I don't know how that would be affected. I would hope that a person putting a tiny house on their property would not have their whole tax base reassessed, or brought up to date if they bought it in the 80s or something like that, and that would be a real deterrent. So I think also, senior citizens, people who own houses we may say, hey, they own property, but they may be struggling to pay for that. And so to be able to add, a new structure, a new unit, to get some rental income may be of great benefit. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. And Bob Daddy.
You've got quite a task. Good evening. We batted some of these things around with the second unit last night at the BAB, and so I'm going to make a bunch of statements, and I'm going to encourage Mr. Summers to tell me I'm wrong on all of them. Chair Merck, you asked an extremely poignant question. When are we going to get the state off our back and tell us stop doing what we can do? So when we look at these different units and we look at these different areas, I want you to keep in mind that out of the 482 or 484 cities, about a quarter of them are chartered, like Ventura, Solvang, Santa Barbara, Pasadena. We're general law. So by general law charter, we pretty much say, hey, whatever the state wants, we accept. We're done, except for climate, topography, geography. We can make some changes for our own health, safety, and welfare. That's pretty much it. So when you equate what Fresno's doing, and I think that's terrific, make sure you're talking about the same type of governmental structure. I'm glad to have a place where people can actually have tiny homes with wheels, be mobile, and I think it's something where at least people that have that determination are going to get to go do that. Here, I run into some different situations. We have almost 6,000 houses that have burned to the ground in a habitat that's the same there as it is here. We probably need to think about changing some of the discussion, and can I have a little more time, because I'm speaking on a little bit different term here. We're going to have to make sure that everything we do from now on is pretty much hardened. I don't see the fire zone staying the way it is. The fire map is totally incorrect and needs to be readjusted. And in 6 weeks, CAL FIRE will be here and we'll start that process. Last night, we had Fire Safe Council here. We have a fire behavioral scientist that used to be the head forester here. So when we get into these things, it almost might be kinder to try to separate some verbiage and vernacular for the viewing public and everybody. And when we talk about tiny homes that are not on wheels, not the tea house, I really don't see much different between an efficiency unit than a tiny home, because you can go all the way down to almost nothing with the efficiency unit. An efficiency unit, while they may be 150 square feet today, the law has already been passed to move them down to 120 square feet. But it really hasn't been passed to allow them not to meet building code, fire standards. I remember what your question, Mr. Summers, and when does this stop? He said they're pretty much everywhere except high fire zones and coastal. And we have a high fire zone. So there's got to be an expectation that when tiny homes come in, and I'm not for or against, I'm just trying to kind of separate what's going on. When tiny homes come in, they're going to have some health and safety factors, not only for themselves, but for their neighbors. So when we take a look at the current fire codes, guess what we now know? They didn't work. When we take a look at the separation of the fire divisions, they didn't work. When we take a look at a lot of the constructions, we know they didn't work. Nothing stops a wind-driven fire. And we've got some pretty good wind-driven areas here, some high fire areas. So I like the term sheet. We've talked about this a little bit. There really needs to be a difference and put it in. I don't know what the technical difference is going to be between the efficiency unit at 120 or 150. It certainly will be different than the 220. What we batted around last night, without the benefit of counsel who has a inquiry to him now, we determined that probably the 220 minimum has to do with the existing non-permitted secondary units now. That's a 220. That's where they are. If you come in to do the same replication, you can be down to 150 today. July 1, you can be down to 120. So if you can kind of separate the terms, because I don't see, like I say, ADU efficiency unit are the same, just the size difference, minimum. And then the tiny home, not on wheels, I don't see where there's a difference between that and the efficiency unit. And then you have some other things that you need to take care of, which is the transportation. To hit the street, they've got to have a plate. When they have a plate, we've got HCD and DMV involved. And so we add other layers of levels of government code that get stacked on. So the other thing is, Jester, you asked a fantastic question 2 months ago, and I'd heard this batted around for 2 years, not by you, but by everybody. What are the rules on compostable toilets? So I called sanitary district and I asked them, and I got an answer from somebody else. Environmental health. They were very precise, very curt, very stringent. And they have a definite attitude, and evidently they have definite authority. And I was just requesting information, not permission to do one, and I thought it was pretty contrite. It was followed up without response to them about an hour later with a little bit more egregious language with tightening it down. So there are other factors that are going to be out of the city's ability, in my opinion. They're not going to be able to overcome some of the state laws, certainly not environmental health when it comes to these compostable toilets. So I would then hope that, as Mr. Summers says, that some of this thing's going to go back to Title IX, which is going to be the BAB, correct?
It would depend on how the council directs the matter.
Right. It'll come back, I'm pretty sure, to us. And so whatever you need, we'll certainly work with you, pass ideas back. We can at least talk a little bit, and we'll be doing everything we can to support you. And we have an entire huge stack of different codes. It's just now a matter of finding out who trumps what and whether you're going to be allowed to put these tiny homes under the housing code, which is 1941, which is very liberal. That's the same standards when you sell an older home now. Or it's going to be under today's current building code, which is everything except fire sprinklers.
So, Mr. Daddy, this has been about 3 times at home.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thanks very much. This is still a public hearing. We have people bringing speakers cards up even as we speak. Thanks. So Dale, if you just say your name and...
Yes, Dale Hansen. I live in the city of Ojai. Good evening. I am a tiny house advocate. However, I do think that they should be on a permanent foundation, not on wheels, because they shouldn't be pulled off. I think there's a state law that requires that the ADU cannot be sold separately, so therefore they should be on a permanent foundation attached. I think they should be attached to our sanitary district and all the other utilities. And I think that they should meet our building codes, particularly health and safety and the fire. And I think there are other things I wanted to say, but that really just about covers it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to speak on this subject? Thank you.
Good evening, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Vina Lustado. First, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the City Council and Planning Commission members for taking this matter forward for consideration into the ADU ordinance. It has been a long road since June 2016, when City Council gave approval to consider tiny homes for affordable housing. I certainly appreciate the thought and diligence that will be put into creating a new ordinance for tiny houses. Based on the listed items on the agenda, I would like to address a few of the items. First, tiny house identification definition. I would like to bring to attention that there is currently an approved national code for tiny houses under the International Residential Code called Tiny House Appendix V. And actually, it's recently more modified as Appendix Q. In that code, the term for tiny house is movable tiny houses, not tiny homes on wheels, simply because tiny homes on wheels will not be under the building code if it is considered on wheels. I would like to request that we change the term to movable tiny house so it is in keeping with the IRC appendix. Second item, code issues. What types of permit is required? I would like to point out that one of the major challenges of building is the cost for permitting. To build a guest house in the city or the county, it costs about $20,000 to $30,000 just for permitting cost. This leaves almost no money left for construction, nor development costs for utilities. We absolutely want to abide by the codes that provide health and safety of the occupant. Please consider a third-party certification process to expedite the permitting, thereby minimizing permit fees. This is what was proposed from the presentation by Dan Fitzpatrick last year. Third item, uses. I would like to have the Commission consider tiny homes for emergency shelters for those who are left homeless due to fires or earthquakes. With current wildfires destroying over 300 housing units in an area already impacted by a housing shortage and lack of affordable housing, it is time for state recognition of movable tiny houses as a valuable solution to the recovery efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak on this? Okay, this is a discussion item, so I don't really close the public hearing, but I'll bring it back to the commission. Any further comments from anybody on the commission?
I had a question, and it would apply to fellow commissioners and staff and the city attorney. I suddenly recall there is a flock of small structures in Casita Springs. I think we've probably all seen it. It looks like, to me, the footprint of each of those structures is somewhere between 10 and 20 square feet. I don't know what they are. I don't think they're tiny houses.
10 or
But-
20 square feet, that's not livable, that's not even, you can't.
No, it's right. You can't even lie down in the
Yeah.
darn thing. And there's like a
Must be a
little
storage
grid of
unit
them
or
there.
something. Must be
Um,
storage.
We're not familiar with the
Okay.
property you're referring to.
Okay.
Apologies.
We're not going to do that.
Yeah. 10 by 10 isn't big enough to do anything.
All right. Any further discussion, or Mr. Summers, do you have any, do you have the direction that you need on this, or do you want?
I think we're looking for a little more discussion. The only point I would add in terms of the points raised by Mr. Daddy, two, one, it will be up to the council whether to have the Building Appeals Board consider this matter, but as is obvious, there are pieces of this that overlap between building code and zoning code, certainly. Particularly given that much of the present pieces of law that prohibit tiny houses, particularly tiny houses not on wheels, are contained in the building code as opposed to the zoning code. You could do, with the right set of facts, you could build under current code a small stick-built house that would be, quote, tiny, and would be compliant with the zoning code, but not necessarily meet the building code's standards. Tiny houses on wheels is another story. That would presently prohibited in 3 or 4 different ways. And then the other point, in terms of looking at the different term definitions, bear in mind that efficiency unit, and as it's used in various pieces of state law, doesn't necessarily include a kitchen. And tiny houses may or may not include a kitchen as well. So it's another one about precision of language is key in evaluating these, the proposal. And lastly, what we have now is a number of issues that we could take to council, but we would certainly appreciate some additional discussion if there is any among the commissioners. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Jagiel?
Well, there's a lot to be said about it. I like to just go through the list here and just give you some feedback that I have. I have brought with me some of the things that were given to the Planning Commission and the City Council prior. One of them is the actual ordinance from the City of Fresno, which I have copies here if anybody wants that. You could pass these out. I got one for everybody. Also, Dan Fitzpatrick, when he gave us his presentation, he came out with a definition of tiny homes that he used in the City of Fresno. He went ahead and adopted our ordinance at the time, which has been changed. We no longer have this ADU ordinance, but he went ahead and incorporated the language into that ordinance as well. It's very similar to the document you have, but you'll be able to see those definitions there as well. So, and this is the first time I've heard from Vina about the mobile tiny home without wheels. I think that's very interesting. I'd like to have the staff really look into that. I really don't understand the definition compared to the definition that's used in the Fresno ordinance. The Fresno ordinance, it's defined as tiny homes on wheels, and it is, they are a unique structure, and they do require a very specific definition. And we did a lot of work, and we had a lot of discussion. Many of you members were not here during that time, and a lot of that discussion was had to do with how the tiny home, how it would apply to some of our ordinances, especially the facade, what it would look like, and so on and so forth. And it's summed up that as long as the tiny home was in someone's backyard, in the rear of their property, unseen from the street, there was much more leeway in their design. Whereas if the tiny home was seen close to the house itself, it would have to resemble the structure of the house itself. Those are a couple of definitions that we had discussed in the past. It's what's really interesting is this picture here. And this is in your book, but unfortunately, you got this very black and white, very terrible copy, and I don't know how that happened, because I would have liked to have a full color copy, because these are the same tiny homes, and one's on wheels and one is not, and it's the same unit that's skirted. And all of these, we can all agree that are completely acceptable architecturally speaking. They're stick frame structures. They're not only are they stick frame structures, they're also, from a sustainable standpoint, you're not having to build a foundation. You're not having to disrupt the land in order to place them. Economically speaking, in order to move a tiny home on wheels to a site is very cost effective. We can use the ANSI code which is the state. Is it national or state?
It's not national. It's not a government. ANSI is a national corporate organization.
Right, but is
on the microphone. ANSI is a national corporate organization. It's like the Underwriters Laboratory. It's industry regulating industry. It's not a government.
right? Is it accepted though?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Well, it's accepted in the city of Fresno. That's under their definition.
That would be the choice for the council, is whether they
Yeah,
wish to apply the ANSI
exactly.
standard or some other standard.
And the ANSI standards can apply to this. So there's a lot of benefits. Also on the sheet here, it said, attaches an outline of potential issues which might be relevant to determination whether tiny homes are a viable, affordable housing option for the city of Ojai. Now, I want to speak to that viable, affordable option because I can't figure any better viable option than a tiny home on wheels. And it's all has to do with the math. These documents are in your folder as well. And the average cost, this shows that an average cost of a tiny home is $65,000 to $70,000. Well, I just did a Google search, and I could tell you right now that you can buy some really nice tiny homes for $39,000 to $59,000 that are very nicely done, brand new. So if you take that equation, you take that amount of money, we added to that amount. So on the original sheet, we added $25,000 for hookup fees. Part of that $25,000 was the $16,500 of the sewer district, which may or may not apply, depending on the new regulations that are coming down from the state, correct?
SB 229 passed and was signed by the governor earlier this month. SB 229 provides that an accessory dwelling unit is defined in Government Code Section 65852.2 cannot be assessed a local agency capacity charge or connection fee, including by any special district, including OVSD and any other similarly situated special district.
Okay, so
that blocks fees on accessory dwelling units. The tiny houses, it would depend on whether the tiny house issue meets that definition or not. Most would.
Okay, well, using those numbers, the high numbers, $65,000 to $70,000 per unit, $25,000 preparation costs, we're at $90,000 of a total investment to set a tiny home. If you were to borrow that money at the current rate of 5%, but let's not talk about how much you can borrow that money for, but let's talk about what kind of return would that be. So if you invested $90,000 and you got $9,000 a year, which is $750 a month rent, you would be making 10% on that money. Correct? That's a good investment. It's actually 9.5%. So now if we were to take those numbers and we would go down, for instance, you bought a tiny home for 70, so if you would reduce that number by the $16,500 sewer fee, you're talking about, you can lower that rent to $650 per month and still get a 10% return on that money. Where can you find a house in Ojai, a room to rent for $650 a month? And that also gives you a 10% return on your money. It is beyond affordable, and it's affordable by design. Now, if we also reduce the cost, if it is a ANSI code related structure whereby it would just go, so going down the list to, where is that? What type of permits are required? I think the minimal building permits would be required, which are utilities, skirting. I think we would encourage a deck to be placed around them. However, the deck, if it's less than 18 inches, isn't required to get a permit. I would say we'd go through zoning clearance.
ledge.
What?
That's a ledge,
What's that?
not a deck.
Whatever, under 18 inches, you're not required to get a permit in the city of Ojai. Correct?
Geller was referring to not the width of the ledge, but the height of the height of the deck off the ground.
Oh,
You only need a permit for a deck taller than 18 inches
Yeah.
off of the
Sorry.
ground. Sorry to clarify that.
So again, permitting would be quick, efficient, and very, very, very affordable. You wouldn't have to pay the $25,000 fees that are required to design, create structural drawings, to create architectural drawings and submit them to the city for permits. And again, there's precedence for this, the city of Fresno. So those are the type of issues that I'd like to have us focus on, because it is affordable by design, and I can't think of a better option out there. I mean, nobody has presented that to me, so I don't know where that exists.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Nolan?
And this is just an aesthetic point, but what we did discuss in our previous meetings, when we were talking about the tiny homes on wheels, or now the mobile tiny homes, if I got that term right, was that we do have the ability to create design criteria, if we feel necessary. So in other words, they would have to, there'd be scrutiny that you would have to follow certain design criteria to bring. In other words, you couldn't just it couldn't look just like anything if we decided to go forward with something like that to make it more compatible with the architecture in Ojai.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Mr. Quilisi?
I suspect most people know, my general philosophy is you should be able to do what you want with your own stuff, like your backyard, so long as it doesn't bother the neighbors. And you have taken proper account of public health and safety in the process. I don't know right now whether these tiny homes on or off wheels are going to have Class A roofs, for example. And we've just seen in Napa and Sonoma and Santa Rosa where a wind-driven fire takes everything in its path. I'm doing some work on my house right now, and I'm putting a Class A roof on. I'm not sure what the old roof was, but I know about the new one. And I think that once we get into the area of either the health and safety kinds of regulations, unless they are things that can be certified in a factory, and the city accepts that certification, that we are still going to have a bunch of effort by city staff. And, we set design criteria, but those design criteria have to be verified on every unit. I am personally opposed to tiny houses on wheels because we suddenly become a town full of transients.
But
And
we
don't have any trailer parks,
Right.
excuse the phrase,
Right.
other than the rental Airstreams down Bryant Street.
Yeah, but we do have
We
the
don't have we don't
ability
have
to
trailer parks in
regulate
town.
that.
Yep.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I agree, you have ability to regulate that. And also, I don't think that precludes having tiny homes off wheels either. I mean, that's another
For me, that's a
option.
whole separate conversation.
Well, on here, it's the same conversation. We
it's-
have permanent foundation
yeah,
units. So
it's-
the other thing, I was going to make also a recommendation there as well. I know some individual architects in town are working on what you would call a CAN plan, that would be pre-approved by any jurisdiction of, let's say, efficiency units or tiny homes, anywhere between 120 to 250 square feet, or even larger. And part of that would also be to reduce the cost of permitting. If those plans went through the approval process, through the city of Ojai, and they were stamped. There are those in the past. If you go to, I think we still use in the city of Ojai the Ventura County version of the approved garage plan? Okay, well, we had it in the past. There was a time when we would go into the city, I pulled a few of these permits, I'd ask for the CAN plan for for a garage unit, and they would supply, and I would not have to provide drawings except for a site plan. So the same thing could apply to tiny homes, which would save off wheels on foundations, which is something I also would recommend the city consider. There are a few architects in town that are willing and able to offer that service and provide those plans to get pre-approved for that process. And that would save individuals and clients a lot of money going through that process.
I
And
would
they could
agree
expedite
it would. I think the old saw about trust but verify still applies here, though.
What do you mean by that?
If there are design criteria or building standards or connection standards, they still have to be verified in a tiny home on or off wheels.
Right, on a permanent foundation, that's a stick-built home as far as I'm concerned. It's just
Well,
a tiny stick-built home.
it might be manufactured and
It could
dropped
be
onto a
That's
foundation,
true, that's
but
true.
it should meet the same public health and safety requirements as a stick-built on the same site,
Right.
I think.
Well, I think we already have the codes that address that as far as for modular units
Yeah.
and for stick-built units. So those, the plans would comply to the current codes. So to me, that's a given. It's the tiny home on wheels that's a little bit more difficult to define. And these jurisdictions had a difficult time defining it, for sure. And they've done it to the degree that's been, and it's been somewhat successful in the city of Fresno. So I see both of those things as when we create this matrix, or I can see tiny homes on wheels. I can see mobile tiny homes. What's this definition? The new definition that movable tiny homes. I'd like to know more about that. And then we have permanent, just stick-built tiny homes that I believe will or should adhere to the lower square footage of the new state rules of, what is it going to be, 120 square feet? And those are kind of our options that we can look at, and we can spread those out on a sheet and then look at the pros and cons to each one of those and create a matrix, and just like we did on the ADU.
Okay, Commissioner Corbin.
Well, I just want to say that this is an obvious reaction to the fact that permitting and codes have gotten so out of hand that now what we're trying to do is find a way around that, which I am in favor of. But I think that, it also points out the fact that we need to look at those issues, and we need to figure out why it's so expensive, why we charge so much for all the things that we do when we permit, as opposed to just saying, well, I'll get it from a factory and I'll put it on wheels and it doesn't meet and then it's, a whole different thing. I think there's an inherent problem in the whole permitting process, not only in Ojai, but the whole state of California. And I think that that's a really big issue. And, what happens is a tiny home get bolted down so it's earthquaked, or is it a vehicle, or what is it? If somebody lives in it, then, you know what I'm saying? I'm saying that it's like a whole can of worms, and there's an inherent problem in the whole building industry here.
Great, thank you.
Just a comment about that. I don't see what we're doing as trying to get out of, not permitting something and not meeting code. I think once we have this matrix, it's going to be a lot easier. And then if we go across item by item, whether it's a mobile tiny house or, it's a fixed unit on a foundation, we'll be able to look at it and say, oh, that falls under a different code. And then we can make the recommendation to council, does it hook up to water, does it have the wastewater? And we have the ability to make all those recommendations. So I
I'm just
see that as
making the
coming.
recommendation that we look
Yeah.
at our permitting process and figure out if we can make it more efficient and more affordable.
Right, so
to
that's a
begin
different
with.
topic, I
It is a
guess.
different
Okay.
topic, but I think
Yeah.
that this is a reaction to that.
Well, it's in part a reaction to that, but I think it's primarily a reaction to the cost of housing, the cost of the housing itself.
But that's part of it.
The permitting is part of that. I really worry about the tiny homes on wheels because it sounds to me like a trailer. In fact, if you look at the Fresno code, it tracks right along with the proposed change to 10-2-1709, and it defines the Fresno code defines a tiny house in the same language as the tiny home on wheels in the proposed changes to the Ojai code. So in Fresno, a tiny house is an object that is licensed and registered with the DMV, period. It's always on wheels. You can pick it up and truck it to Oregon anytime, and I think that's a fine thing if people want to do that. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with objects of that nature proliferating in all of our neighborhoods. If we're talking about second units, if we're talking about guest houses, if we're talking about ADUs or junior ADUs, I think there's a market for affordable housing there, and those can be made small, which makes them affordable by design. But it also means that it's a permanent addition to the community, and there is a homeowner there who owns that structure and is responsible for it. Whereas a tiny home on wheels could be anyone who decides to rent some space in my backyard for a while. I think the taxation becomes problematic, though that's not our problem, but the utility connections become very problematic because no two tiny houses on wheels or movable tiny houses or whatever you wish to call them are going to have the same kind of electrical, water, wastewater, and other utility connections. And so it becomes a real problem. Do we set up some universal standards for sewers? And then anybody who wants to park a movable tiny house in my backyard has to buy an adapter to those universal standards? I think we're getting into a real can of worms here. Yes, sir.
Can you see any way to create a set of restrictions that could avoid some of that? For instance, and if someone applies for a tiny home on wheels permit to put it in the back, in their rear yard property, can there be a rule or a law that states that that permit can only be applied for that existing structure for a period of time that reduces the transient nature of it, let's say 5 years?
I'm not sure that putting a minimum time on there
Okay, well, if you were to
would do
have to get a
anything but
permit,
encourage people to think of that object as something that will eventually move out of the backyard and go somewhere else.
well, what I'm suggesting is there parameters that we could set that avoids the very thing that you're concerned
Yeah,
about?
I don't know.
Well,
I
that's
don't know.
that's what I'm
something we
opening
need
up for a
to- We
discussion.
need to talk
right.
through, I would agree.
Yeah.
The other thing that concerns me about, well, one other thing that concerns me about the movable tiny house, or whatever we're calling it now, is that it is not by definition a housing structure owned by the property owner of the property on which it resides.
It could be.
It could be.
Right.
But it also could be some third party who's here for a week or
Well,
for a month
I
or
think.
whatever. And I'm not sure that we want that kind of a community. The city council just said you can't do short-term rentals. Well, that sounds like it could be a short-term rental of space in my backyard.
Then you actually build that, excuse me, then that's something potentially we could create the parameters for.
Right.
It's possible that we could.
Yeah.
I'm saying
Exactly.
those are issues that come to mind with me immediately, and
Right.
I don't want them overlooked if we get
Yeah.
much deeper into this
Right.
conversation.
And I know that we had discussed this prior to you being on the commission, so
Yes,
I realize it's
I'm a
all
newbie.
new, and I appreciate the questions you brought up, because we, in fact, brought up those exact same questions in the past,
Okay,
so it's
good.
pertinent.
I had a question for staff. Matt, can you limit the amount of tiny homes permits? Can you limit a permit like that?
By limit,
Like, say, we're going to only issue.
what do you mean by limit? Do you mean by number?
Only issue 15 a year, let's say.
Yeah, with the right findings, the city council could impose a limitation on the number
There-
equivalent.
That's tough findings.
The city council could
Well, right
do
now,
that.
we have a limitation on it right now. You can only,
Yes.
how many
There is an ex-
dwellings? I think 10 is the limit, right?
I don't have the number in front of me. I believe
Have
that
it already.
Really?
Yes, we do.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
Lord.
been in place for 20
the
years.
city has a long-standing residential growth management ordinance that limits the number of new single-family residential and multifamily residential building permits
New
each
build.
year.
New build, yeah.
And also conversions of new units out of existing structures. There are several exceptions to the growth management ordinance, the most important of which is accessory dwelling units by state law are exempt from the growth management ordinance. The city council could certainly apply a version of a growth management ordinance to tiny house permits, should the council so choose.
But I think you made it clear earlier that a movable tiny house is not an ADU.
Movable tiny house is not an ADU, no, it wouldn't be.
A tiny house on a permanent foundation might be an ADU, it might be something else.
It would depend on how the council sets the definitions. A tiny house on wheels would not be subject to the automatic state exemption from the city's growth management ordinance, but the city could certainly impose it or not impose it, as the council so chose.
Well, and those are the types of parameters I think we can look at on a matrix. We can say, okay, well, yeah, it's a new thing for the city of Ojai. It's a new thing to live with, and maybe we limit that and see how it goes instead of saying no. We're afraid of that. We're afraid what that's going to look like, and maybe we let that go. And also, we can extend the permit time. We can define the permit. And, if you're putting in a unit, there's a time frame on it. So if you move that unit, you can't put another unit, you can't just move another unit onto your property without getting another permit. And then if we extend the time of that, let's say in a 5-year duration, it's going to discourage people from moving on and off. 5 years or whatever the time period is would discourage people from doing that. And especially if they had to go get a second permit to do it again, and there was a time frame between the first one and the second one. So to me, there are ways we can come up with that dissuades people from being too mobile with it, but yet still having that flexibility or the advantage of the tiny home on wheels. And especially if you're going to skirt it, you're going to remove the wheels, it's going to basically look like a regular home. It's going to be built like a regular home. There's still a lot of advantages to it.
But it may be another party owning a residential dwelling of some sort on my property. And I think that's a major conceptual hurdle to get over.
We could look at that too, put that on the matrix, and it could be owner provided. Homeowner provided.
Then why would a homeowner
Because of the
put a
cost.
mobile unit?
'Cause the
Put a
cost.
mobile unit.
Cost. You can buy, because the economy of
The
scale.
difference between wheels and a foundation?
It's huge because the economy of scale. Tiny homes is a big movement. You can go buy a tiny home because they're pre-made. They're open to market pricing. You can get a beautiful, almost brand new tiny home for $39,000. Where if you hired a local contractor to stick build anything in your backyard, you're not even going to come close. You're not going to come close. The people are busy now, especially busy this time of year. So, and when they're busy, the costs are high. So I just don't see us competing with the ability to hire out. Now, that option is there for people, and I want to give people that option. I think that we should look into that. But to just know that, tiny homes on wheels, there's an economy of scales there because you can buy them on the open market. And just like in some respects, there's a depreciation value, which people can take advantage. Like I said, I've seen, if you just Google tiny homes for sale, you're going to be amazed at the type of homes that are available at a low cost. And if you start putting all those numbers together and give someone the ability to put that in their yard, and we restrict the time so that the mobility issue is kind of taken into consideration, and we limit the amount of permits in a given year, all those things can really be doable.
And we make sure that we're following all the
Fire
public
codes and-
safety,
yeah,
the
and
fire
safety.
codes.
Exactly.
That we have all of the utility connections already in the yard, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes,
Then we're at a point where I have fewer objections.
right. And I think that's why I think we do this matrix, and we look at those things. And I think codes is going to be one of those items on that list.
So if I could interrupt, we have two other commissioners over to my left here who would like to join the conversation.
Thank you.
So, Commissioner Isabella, you want to jump in there?
Could you tell? So, the gentleman who spoke, the tiny home advocate, really sort of voiced my worst fears by confirming that this is all about mobility and transience. And that, hey, as he said in my quote, if Ojai runs out of water, I'll just go to Oregon. And that attitude really concerns me, because this is our community and we are trying to provide affordable housing for the people who live here. Not provide a place to flop for people to come and use our resources, not be invested in the community, and then split. If and he asked what's the problem with transients? Well, for people who live here and who have, scrimped and saved to either make their rent or, make their mortgage, having a revolving door in your backyard, your neighbor's backyard, is a problem. You never know who's going to live there. You just don't have a sort of certainty about where you're living and who you're living next to. And so, like I said, that kind of confirmed my worst fears. When I look at this issue, I look at it like I look at every other issue, what I think is good for the city as a whole. I look at the benefits and I look at what the potential negative impacts are. And I think we have to remember that this city just passed, in the name of affordability, the ability to add a second unit on every single lot in the city, up to 1,200 square feet under certain parameters. And that is in addition to every single house having the potential to be divided into 2 units. So this city just passed what I consider to be a very draconian sort of change to the ordinance to allow a whole lot more building, all in the name of affordability. And this city is taking the brunt of that issue by opening it up to that degree. And whether one thinks that's a good thing or a bad thing, I guess that remains to be seen. We think our streets are crowded now. We think they're unsafe for our kids who play near the street because there's so many cars parked on it. We think our water and our air is stressed to the max. We think our beautiful green spaces are getting paved over. So now we just added this huge impact of potential for more building. And I'll like to add that in the county, you have to have a minimum of an acre, and you can only build to 700 square feet. So the city is very much out of step with the rest of the county. There's much more potential building going to go on just in the city, whereas in the unincorporated areas, not so much. And none of those second units, don't have to park their cars, so all their cars go on the street. So that, to me, is the context that I'm looking at this discussion about tiny homes with, is wow, we just added this huge potential impact, and that has to play out. We don't know how it's going to play out. And so how much more impact do we tolerate, and what more impacts do we absorb in the name of affordability, and are we actually addressing affordability? So, as I said, this gentleman really sort of was upsetting to me, because when I read about tiny homes, what I read, the biggest problem with tiny homes, and it's, people are legion across the country, they don't have a place to put them. They don't have a place to put them. So all of a sudden, it's Fresno and Ojai, where you can put tiny homes in people's backyards on wheels. I mean, that's really concerning to me. Do we just now become Mecca for that? People who use our services, our natural resources, our infrastructure, but they're not going to pay taxes? How does that help people in our community who need affordable housing? My understanding is that through environmental health, you have to have a hard connection to the sewer. But if you have transients and you have people coming and going, we don't have the ability to really enforce our codes currently. We have pages, every planning commission, we have pages of violations. And these people have gotten a letter, but we don't have the ability to enforce. We don't have the ability to stay on top of this stuff. We can make all the rules we want, but we don't have the resources to do proper code enforcement. So to me, you add something that's moving, it has the ability to move off, that's a moving target. We can't seem to code enforce the things that are not moving targets. We have things that sit and sit and sit, looking the same potential dangerous circumstances, and they just don't change, because it takes a lot to make a change in a difficult situation like that. So in addition to people just deciding, hey, this is the place to come and hang out for the winter, what about the homeowner trying to make a quick buck by bootlegging a connection to the sewer, so the tiny homeowner can drive in and use a flexible pipe in the ground for their waste, or the homeowner that provides no waste facilities at all? And what about a clean, safe water connection? How about extension cords running from the main house? We say we can, make the rules and make the permits, but for something that rolls in and can roll out, by the time, in the meantime, the neighbors are living next to somebody who is, catch me if you can. I've been a realtor in this valley for over 15 years, and I have seen it all. This is my area of expertise, and you would be amazed at the way that people are living when they have the ability to be mobile. And it's just really tough to enforce. So I'm dubious about our ability to really manage this situation. Even if the tiny home doesn't come from somewhere else, I really dispute Mr. Fitzpatrick's numbers on return. I think that if you have to really buy a properly fire-safe, especially with the new codes that are probably going to have to be applied to a tiny home, it's going to be a lot more costly. And it should be costly, because the whole thing, the reason you save money on this stuff is because it's not as safe. The sanitation is not as good, the hookups aren't as good, the fire safety is not as good. It costs money to do that stuff right. To Commissioner Corbin's point, maybe it could cost less. But to do it right and to have something that's truly fire safe and truly provides proper sanitation, that costs money. So I don't think it is the great investment that people think it is. And obviously a homeowner who's providing for a tiny home in his yard can also do those same games to bypass health and safety. Or it could turn into a vacation rental just as easily. Again, I'm not hearing how we're benefiting the people who need affordable housing. I think to the point about if you have a homeowner and you have somebody in a tiny home Who gets the abatement letter from code enforcement? Who is the responsible party? I mean, how do you abate it then? Then do you have a fight between the homeowner and the person who owns the tiny house? And that is personal property if it's on wheels. It's not real property. It's not real estate. Other concerns that I have, so you provide this affordable rental. How many people really have the ability to live that small? But how many people are going to try to cram themselves into something that small because that's all they can afford? And where does all their stuff go? I remember Mr. Fitzpatrick saying, well, they'd hire a storage locker. I mean, again, we're not talking about people who need affordable housing. Mr. Daddy talked about the fire scenario. Coffee Park in Santa Rosa was one of the main affected subdivisions. We look just like them, a subdivision at the bottom of a hill. I mean, I really think we need to get really clear on whether or not these structures pose additional fire hazards and what we would need to do to obviously make them fire safe. The city's a special place, we always say this, and the people who own and rent here, I don't think should be subjected to a transient housing, an element of transient housing. There are people with money coming to this town and buying our real estate, that's for sure, but there are far more longtime Ojai families that have scrimped and gone without in order to make their mortgage payments, and I don't think their property value should be put at risk any more than they already have by the ADU decision. I think there's a point at which we start to tip over and we lose what's beautiful and lovely about this community. And I think we need to be very careful when I don't think we're getting the benefit in terms of affordability, and I think the potential negative unintended consequences are huge. I would be open to hearing more about tiny homes that are on foundations and lashed and all of that, but I would more so favor a tiny home village, a place where, if we really want to provide affordable housing, and I've said this repeatedly, you've got to restrict the rents. The affordable by design thing is a nice idea, but people will always push for market rent. And I think to really meet more people's needs, we need to, a tiny home village or something like that would make a whole lot more sense. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Commissioner Dell. Commissioner Corbin?
Oh, I agree with that about having them in an area, having specific areas, and maybe we could
One
call
per
them.
backyard?
Not in the backyard. And maybe we want to talk about them as manufactured homes more than tiny homes on wheels.
Well, manufactured
Things that are
home is a
pre-built
category.
so that there
Yeah.
is some economy of scale. And I like that idea of having, a foundation that's pre-designed and approved that can just be built simply. I think those are really things to think about in terms of creating potential affordable housing and, things that there's something called the casitas. I don't know if you've seen those. It's a manufactured house out of Austin, Texas. They're magnificent, about 300 square feet. They're very affordable, and they're aiming to make them already approved by permit it's $139,000 if you buy one, but it's $100,000 if you buy a lot. They're aiming to make them permittable already when they arrive there, in lieu of what it costs to build a good structure. That's not bad. But I think there's potential for things that will help us have maybe more affordable housing.
Thank you. Commissioner Powers, did you have you had your light on there a minute ago.
My light's always on, Commissioner Mark. I don't have a lot to add. I think the hard questions are being asked. The challenging inquiries are being brought up. I I appreciate the numbers and the data Commissioner Jaglio brought up, but to me, it's movable tiny homes are, or even on foundation, for me at least, I'm not looking at it, oh, it's affordable to build and there's a 10% return. That doesn't, for me, address the hard issue, the hard questions. You know, here's dollars and cents, and it's a good investment. But some people think strip malls are a good investment. Some areas, they don't work. So I don't have a lot to add. I mean, the fact that CAL FIRE is going to be here and the whole fire hazard map is going to be redone, in some way, just that alone is going to restrict the type of smaller units that can be built, whether on wheels or not, because a lot of areas that are now you can build in and not have a hard surface, you're going to probably need to have a hard surface. So that thumbprint of a 4.5 square mile city is going to get reduced considerably once the new fire hazard map comes out. So in some ways, the conversation we're having is a little premature, even though it's an important conversation to have. I just don't think the area that will be available will be the same as it is now. I'm very, very much condone the idea of a tiny home village, and we've spoken at this at length before, and in the Sustainability Committee, we've been speaking about this. What would a sustainable tiny home village look like that's a model community somewhere on, some acreage, and have them there. And I think that would be a really positive social experiment and could be a model. The fact that Fresno right now is the only area in California where movable tiny homes are allowed, and then, let's say, just as a example, Ojai is the second. So now there's only 2 cities in California that are allowable, and the word Mecca was used, and that I can completely understand that concern. That given the marketing that's come to Ojai in terms of being such a beautiful community to live in, which we all know what it is, then suddenly there's only 2 places in California, if you have a tiny home, you can flock to. And I don't see how time permitting, having a permit that's based on time, can even be enforced.
Easily, you can't get another permit. I mean, you go.
Yeah, but how do you even track how do you assign personnel in a database to go, okay, that's permit up? You might have permits up.
It's filed, a permit date is filed, and it's easy to do.
Well, it's,
I'm not suggesting, it is an easy thing to do.
I understand that's a solution. I'm not sure that would be a viable solution, but I understand it's a, solution to have a conversation about.
If the thing to be inspected or certified or whatever can disappear in the middle of the night, how do you really enforce regulations?
So these are the hard questions.
Yeah.
I don't have a conclusion, but, to stay in the inquiry and ask the questions are important. The idea is, if movable tiny homes are allowed, does it get restricted to they have to be owned by the property owner versus someone who wheels in? So then if it's owned by the property owners, why would it need to be a movable one versus on a foundation?
Cost.
Right, so that's another conversation of how do we lower costs, as Commissioner Corbin mentioned, because since I've been on this commission time and time and time again, I've heard how much it costs to get permits and hookup and all that, and that's a whole distinct conversation of how can that be addressed. You know, how can we create a circumstance where a home that's on a foundation is a kit home, a modular home that's pre-approved and can just be set on there and saves tens of thousands of dollars. That's sort of a distinct conversation.
To me, it's one of the 4 options that we identified. And if we put them on the matrix, I think it'll start to it'll start clarifying itself once we start looking at the hard questions on each one of those line items. And I believe each one of those options will start to show which one's more viable than the other. So the exercise, I think, is still worth doing, and I think
Conversation worth having.
yeah,
yes.
worth having and concluding, especially for the tiny home community. I think whatever conclusion we come to, we should be well thought out and have good facts associated with it. So if we do this matrix, we add the 4 units, which are I have written as the tiny home on wheels, the mobile tiny home that Vina just mentioned tonight,
How's that
the
different?
tiny home modular unit, and the tiny home constructed unit.
I think
On a
she was saying
foundation.
that's just a different language, right? The tiny homes on wheels and the movable.
Correct. I understood all 3 of the last things you said to be the same thing. In other words, the line is a tiny house permanently attached or a tiny house that's mobile.
You have to go.
Oh.
With the chair's permission.
Vina, can you explain the difference to us?
Yes. So it's movable tiny homes versus tiny homes on wheels. It's the same thing. The only difference is that in the IRC Appendix V, they have turned it movable tiny homes because the building code does not accept on wheels as part of a definition because it brings it back to another classification like an RV. So that's in consideration of what could be done in the future to have the acceptance for IRC approval for tiny homes. I would like to request to change our terminology now versus later to movable tiny homes so that it can readily be adapted for the IRC Appendix V. Does that make sense?
Sure.
In
Yeah,
part,
so then we would.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think staff will need to put a fine point on all of that and define what is, if it doesn't have wheels in the definition, do they still have wheels? Is it still on a
From-
chassis on wheels?
From what was just stated, I understand it to be physically the same thing, just the name changed.
It seems
But
to
nonetheless,
be,
these are the issues that'll be identified further and then analyzed further should the council direct analysis of this issue.
All right. So do you have enough information now to go ahead with your,
I think we have enough information to take this to council. We'll work with the existing issue identification sheet we have now, greatly expand it to reflect the discussion tonight, and I think we'll work to put together a staff report that will not answer the questions, but ID the questions for council to consider.
great, thank you. That's, we're pretty much done with this for now. So it's going to go on to the city council, and then they are going to come back to us and say, okay, you can talk about this now. Because right now, this is just like a preliminary, trying to see if it's even worth bringing up to the city council. So I think we've established that pretty well. And then we'll see what happens when it goes to the city council. So we're going to move on. Thank you all for all your input. I hope that was a meaningful discussion. Did you extracted some meaning from that? All right. We're going to move on to our future agenda items, which is a blank page at the moment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, right now, we don't have any items scheduled for November 1st. We may be canceling that due. Yeah, but I don't think that's going to happen. So. Right now, I don't, if I had to predict, I think that meeting will be canceled.
Okay. And then Planning Commission reports. Commissioner Nolan, do you have a report on the city council meeting?
Yes, I do. Give me a second here. I was just pulling out, I think I have several reports I have to do tonight, so. I wrote on the agenda, so I'm flipping pages a little bit while I was there. So this is from the October 10th, 2017 City Council. The meeting started off with, typically there's the water presentation by Angelo Spanduro, and he handed that over to, I believe I got this correct, I might have the name not quite right, but Sierra Watershed Progressive and Regina Hirsch. They're a organization located up in the Sierra Nevada, and they've been doing projects all over the state, including one in the not too distant past at Thatcher School. And what she proposed was kind of a strategy for grant funding for the city of Ojai. And specifically, there was a sustainable groundwater grant program. Let me see what else she said. I don't need to go into all the details. But I believe the city was interested in looking into that. So maybe our city council person has a little more information on that. Then there was also a public hearing, and the main topic was the budget. Let's see. They discussed current needs for the city, about maintaining the balanced budget, preferred the retirement benefits. I'm just kind of giving the highlights here. Anyway, they talked about employment benefits for part-time. Oh, no, excuse me, up to 40 people are part-time. Let's see what else. And then they discuss revenues, taxes, licenses and permitting, recreation from the Parks and Rec Department, and then, of course, expenditures with the Police Department, the Administration Department, Public Works, Planning and Building. And they talked about emerging issues, some of them being pension costs, retiree medical insurance benefits, public safety and police, economic downturns, and then capital needs. And that was kind of, there's more to it. I don't need to read out all of it. And then also the item came up for historic landmark designation for the Smith-Hobson House here. And so they were looking at exploring Ojai designation, also state, and then also national landmark. And then the question came up, was the landmark to be just for the building itself, or would it include the entire property and the landscape? And I don't know if that was completely defined yet. I was looking at my notes on that, but they discussed that. I think from what the final thing was the grounds were not included. Somebody could correct me on that if I'm wrong.
There was.
They were included? Okay.
With the exception of the Help of Ojai building.
That's right, okay, thank you. I knew there was a correction on that. And then, of course, the thing about tiny houses, which came to us tonight, that was, a recommendation. And just some general things, the Stewart Canyon area is scheduled for cleanup, as we've been talking about fire safety, so I thought that was a good thing to note. I don't know, I think that generally covered everything.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Jagiella, did you go to the BAB meeting?
No, I did not.
All right. It'll remain in obscurity. And then Commissioners Powers or Nolan about the Sustainability Committee?
Do you want it?
No.
Oh, you want me to? Okay. you want me to. So we met last week. We've been meeting on a regular basis. And we did meet with a couple members from BABS because our intention is to produce basically a list of course, Title 10, but to collaborate with Title 9, which falls under BABS, changes that potentially could happen with the building code in relations to sustainability. And then that recommendation would go to City Council if they wanted us to go further with it or they wanted to prioritize and act on anything. But we kind of went back to some of the key priority areas, once again, would be water and fire. And then, of course, housing kind of ties in with all of that, as came up in our tiny house discussion tonight. What if something's in a fire area? Is it built to meet fire code? Do we have water for another unit to hook up? So it's all kind of overlaps, but that's generally the direction we're going to be going in, and we're going to be continuing with that. Do you want to add anything, Raymond? Okay. No? Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
And then our esteemed city council representative.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion.
I hope it was meaningful for you.
It was, yeah.
Good.
I want to just add a couple things that are questions in my mind, because I don't have a definitive opinion one way or another on it, but it's fascinating to listen to discussion about traffic and affordable housing, because it's a matter of statistical reality that we have one of the highest commuter loads of people in the entire county in terms of people who cannot afford to live here but work here, mainly in the service industry. And so it's always a question, if you're providing more housing, if it's truly affordable, what actually is the net effect on traffic? You can, maybe more, maybe less. It's just a question in my mind, that I always try to think about. The other aspect is that the question that's, again, I'm just giving you one of my perspectives on all this issue, is that how do we maintain the character of this community as much as possible in the face of the increasing stringency of state mandates? Just say no, I don't think accomplishes that. So, it's a matter of managing to what, and again, this is a very much of a changing target. We just had a whole slew of bills signed by the governor whose implications I don't fully understand. I don't know if anybody fully understands. We also had SB 229, as Mr. Summers referred to, signed, which the first effort of the sanitary district to deal with was a bit of a flop. They called an ordinance committee meeting for the other day at 1:30 p.m. They convened, argued about which board member or not could sit at the table, couldn't agree, canceled the meeting. So we don't know whether they're going to adjust their ordinances or not to be in compliance as of January 1. And then the jury, I think, is somewhat out on what does it mean if the sanitary district does not bring their ordinance into compliance by the date, in terms of how much of their ordinance is therefore superseded by state law. I don't know the answers to all those questions, but I do know, and I don't know if for sure it's happened yet, but there has been a request by council members to discuss this whole situation with the sanitary district as soon as possible now that this has been signed into law. I don't know whether that's going to happen this coming Tuesday or not.
I don't believe it's on the Tuesday.
Okay.
I don't believe that item is on the Tuesday agenda.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's going to come at the next one, but I confess that I don't have the entire agenda in my head.
Right. Yeah.
It is coming and will be
It's
definitely
coming.
before the end of the year.
So these are all important issues that I'm just giving you my broader perspective on. To say that there's some tension right now between the city and the school and the sanitary district is factual statement, I believe, right now. In terms of the fact that the city has a vital interest in pursuing our housing element goals, and if another agency is failing to embrace the intent, if not the letter of state law, that becomes an issue for us in the city in terms of the larger rubric of managing our character managing our character in the right way as much as possible in the face of these incessantly increasing state mandates, which I confess I don't fully understand. I don't know if any of us fully understand all the implications.
We're still working through it.
So, I want to, and again, one of the questions I have is, we do know that the non-conforming program for second units are existing housing stock that, if permitted, mean no to additional construction, but count as a positive on our RENA numbers, which helps us with our compliance in terms of, managing our character. where do tiny homes fit into RENA counts? Don't know the answer to the question. One of the things I'm going to be asking for, not for discussion now, I'm just curious how that works. You all know what RENA numbers. So, and so I don't know, we know that second units are affordable by design in terms of counting as RENA. Where do tiny homes fit into all this? So I'm trying to keep an open mind on this. I understand concerns, I understand the pluses, I understand the minuses, but my overall perspective as a council person is how do we best manage our character going into a changing state mandate environment? And I have to admit, I don't have all those answers in my mind. And then, of course, there's all the other issues with resources and so on and so forth. So, there's some interesting issues here that I just want to share. And, of course, no dearth of issues for you guys to be taken up as we move down the road and face these new challenges, both in terms of sustainability, resources, updates in the Ventura County General Plan, the mandates from the state, so on and so forth. I do want to say that, and this is peripherally, and not peripherally, it is part of your responsibility actually under the code, and it has to do with complete streets designs. If you see the blowing and going on with our, the contract's been let, the asphalt trucks are here, the cement's being poured, the complete streets designs are taking shape, and our street program is supposed to be done by Christmas. And for example, if you drive down Bristol, you see the curb outs for safety design at the on the Valley Trail crossing of the streets. So the complete streets principles that you're part of in terms of looking at are being incorporated to the extent never before in this street program. So I think that's a positive, and we are getting some pushback. But again, at the same time, I think that council's spoken clearly in support of this. It's in our code, and it comes down to a philosophical difference. Are transportation corridors just for cars, or are they for everybody, including bikes and pedestrians? So I mean, that's where I think we're moving in that direction, and I appreciate y'all's continued involvement in that. So there's some other things happening, but tomorrow morning we're going to be appealing the county's decision to want to run tanker trucks making left turns off of Creek Road onto 33, which I cannot believe they recommended as a primary route. We're going to be appealing that and saying, let's not kill somebody. I mean, I know this is hyperbole, but for them, they're basically arguing that it's perfectly safe to have tanker trucks, we're appealing that condition.
Is that in conjunction with the center lane for entry onto the southbound 33?
Nope, not a bit. This is the existing configuration of 33. County planning is recommending that the primary route for running tanker trucks out of the Bentley oil field is to make a left turn off of Creek Road onto 33 at any time of the day or night, I believe. Yeah. So the city's appealing that to, just from basic safety point of view, as well as the idea that if we're going to, instead of piping the gas, flaring the gas, we at least ought to be monitoring the emissions. So anyway, I don't know if there's any other questions, but I just, I thought I'd give you my perspective on a couple issues. And looking forward to many things. There's no lack of issues for keep our lives interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That concludes our meeting.